Hey guys, my name's Alex, and welcome to today's video. So, if you haven't watched a video of mine before, we're basically trying to make a first-person fantasy RPG, and I decided to take you guys on the journey with me. But if you watched a video of mine before, thank you so much for coming back. So, today's video is going to be primarily talking about magic and magic systems, and not in the way that you might think where we're talking about magic systems in terms of lore in the game and how it functions story-wise, but rather how magic and abilities will work as a gameplay mechanic within the game. So, firstly, what I did was I looked at a bunch of different examples for inspiration to kind of work out what I like and what I don't like, and what I think works. So I looked at a bunch of different games like Skyrim, Dishonored, Oblivion, Immortals of Avium, The Witcher 3, Destiny 2. The list goes on. Basically, if there was a spell in the game, I played it, just to see how it felt and how it was implemented. And it gave me a bunch of ideas of what I wanted and what I didn't want. So, firstly, what I discovered that I didn't want was I didn't want a quick menu and I didn't want a selection wheel. And there are a lot of games that implement this very successfully. I mean, it's quite common. What comes to mind is Dishonored and also The Witcher 3. The way you switch between abilities is often through a selection wheel. And that's all good and well, and I think it works well in those games. But for me, I found that it kind of hinders the fluidity of the gameplay. It almost takes you out of the combat so you can switch between spells that you're going to use, and it slows things down a bit. And that's not really the kind of feeling I wanted for my game. Something I also didn't want in my game is for the player to have access to all of their spells all at once, at least while they're in combat. And the reason why is I find it causes bloat. So an example is how magic works in Skyrim. Essentially, you have a ton of spells, so many spells that are accessible to a magic user, but you only have 2 slots to assign them to. You have your left hand and your right hand. And if you want to switch them out, what you have to do is essentially pause the game and change what you have equipped. Even if you're using the quick menu, it takes you out of the experience, and it pauses what's going on. So you then have to search through menus to find the exact spell you want for this one situation, and then you might need to switch back again. And I don't like the feeling of that. So I'm trying to stay away from that. So now to focus on what I actually do want in my game. I want smooth gameplay, as I've kind of spoken about. I don't want any pauses or interruptions when you're trying to use your magic or the abilities your character has. Something I also want is the feeling of actually being a mage or a wizard. So you have access to a ton of different spells and abilities that you can switch between. However, I want you to only be able to switch those out when you're out of combat. The concept of this kind of comes in how almost D&D works, or Dungeons and Dragons, where you have to prepare your spells beforehand in order to use them. So I find that forces the player to essentially make conscious decisions of how they want to engage in a fight. What spells do they want to have equipped in the moment in order to deal with whatever challenge they're facing. Something that it was also very important for me is I wanted there to be a logical way for magic-based characters to deal consistent damage while also giving magic to characters who use more conventional weapons like swords. The way I decided to do this is by requiring a magic-based character to use a staff or some sort of magical instrument to cast consistent damaging abilities. So, for instance, a magic-based character would have to use a staff, which allows them to cast consistent fire-based spells in order to do damage, similar to how a melee character would have a sword. And then they would be supplemented by a ton of their more unique magical spells. And the way I decided to handle this was through a slot system. So essentially, a character might have 2 primary slots for abilities that they can assign to those. Then they would have 1 secondary slot and an ultimate slot. And they will be able to access the spells in those slots through hotkeys. So as they're fighting and playing the game and they're using staff to deal primary damage, to use their more interesting or more powerful spells that they keep in their back pocket, they will be able to use them through hotkeys instantly. So now that we've covered how I want the gameplay to work, let's get into actually how I made the gameplay work. So first of all, I had to make a staff to actually use in my game. So we went through the standard processes that you may have seen in my previous videos. We went into Blender, created a staff, fairly simplistic model, nothing too crazy about it, but I wanted it to feel almost general. I wanted it not to feel overly specialized or overly crazy. I wanted it to feel like something baseline. So that's what I went for. And then after that, we went through the standard process of going through Substance Painter, getting it all textured. And for this, essentially what I did was I separated the crystal at the top from the staff base. And the reason why I did that is because they're going to require different materials. The staff base is fairly standard, but I want the crystal to have a specific effect on it. Something that glows, something that makes it look more crystal-like, give it depth. For now, I haven't played with creating a material that I'm really sold on yet, so we're just using a fairly standard emissive material that glows for now, but I am working on it. Once I've put this model in the game, I just created a new weapon type called a staff and made sure that it was held in the right place in the character's hand, and made a few fairly quick animations for the player character for casting. I also made sure that a character is able to block with the staff, because I find it very irritating when you are using a ranged weapon and suddenly you get in melee combat. I find it quite frustrating that you can't just put out your staff and use it to block an attack. So that is there. Once this was all put in place, I needed to create a primary attack and a secondary attack. So for this, it was going to be a standard like fire-based staff. So I wanted a fireball, and then for the secondary attack, I was looking for maybe just a more improved, more large-scale fireball. I will be honest, I looked at a lot of Vermintide 2 for inspiration on how to do this. So to keep it quite simple for you guys, because I also want to explain almost how I put the effects together, the fireball is essentially just a ribbon that has a constant scrolling effect over it to make it look like it's on fire. And I have a capsule at the end that is a fairly simple shape to create in Blender that goes over the end of the ribbon to make it look more like a fireball. And I've put a few sprites in the center that always face the camera to kind of fill out the effect so it doesn't look hollow and adds more of a glowing effect to it. Then along with that, there's just a couple of streaming particles at the end, so when the character fires the fireball, it leaves sparks behind. Along with this, I just made a muzzle effect for the spell leaving the hand, and then an impact effect, which were fairly basic. But yeah, I think it turned out quite nicely. It looks like a basic fireball attack, like a small firebolt that you would fire, and I made sure that it leaves a little bit of a burn mark on the walls using decals, and I'm actually quite happy with it. I think it looks pretty good for a first draft. And then for the secondary attack, so essentially what I wanted was the character to be able to hold down the attack button, and you would draw in draw out more fire energy from the staff. So instead of just firing a quick bolt of fire from the tip of the staff, you now draw the fire out of it with your hand and kind of create a larger fireball in the palm of your hand. And then when you release it, I wanted it to have more weight behind it. So my reasoning behind it was that I didn't want you to be able to shoot it off like a rocket. I wanted it to be a little bit, it to require some more skill to use. So you have to kind of anticipate how far the enemy is and make sure you're aiming high enough to hit them. So the way I made this effect is essentially just a sphere with a scrolling effect going around it, an emissive scrolling effect to make sure it looked like there's fire running around it. And then the sphere is also rotating at a slight angle to create the effect of movement. And then along with this, I have a bunch of fire sprites running using sub-UVs inside this fireball. So that looks like this fireball is containing a flame within it. So it's actually not too complicated, but I feel like the effect works. I am middling on it at the moment. You obviously compare yourself a lot to other games when you're trying to make one. And in some games, I think, this actually looks kind of good. And then you look at some amazing AAA titles and you're like, it could be better. But for now, as a solo dev and someone who doesn't specialize in VFX, I'm quite happy with it. I think it looks kind of cool. And now along with that, I had to create a secondary particle effect for this, which adds a trail to it. So when you shoot this fireball at a target, it leaves a bit of a arcing trail behind it, which I thought looked quite nice. And along with that, I needed to make a much larger impact effect that shows that this attack was much more devastating than the normal firebolt. And the way I did that is actually by using an expanding sphere. So when it hits an area, a sphere starts small and expands to simulate an explosion, and it has a similar scrolling effect on it. And then I have a sprite which increases in size as well. It's actually quite a fairly basic system, but when you put it all together, it looks quite nice. Now onto some spells that I've been working on for the slots. First of all, we have an ice-based spell, and it uses a lot of the logic that was used in my ice arrows from my previous video. So essentially what you can do with it is you can shoot a wave of ice out in front of you and it freezes enemies in place. And essentially what this is doing is it's using a bunch of Spike 3D models that get cast out in front of the character using particle effects, and these grow. They grow outwards in order to make it look like the ice is actually appearing. And then along with that, I have some particles spawning along the ground to make the floor look icy. And there's a bunch of smaller particle effects that are also happening where the ice forms, and so you have some breaking ice shooting into the air. And then when the ice falls apart, I wanted it to look like it shatters. So essentially along the path of the ice, a bunch of smaller ice shards burst into the air and fall onto the ground, making it look like the ice is actually broken apart. Then for the actual effect that basically affects the enemy, I'm using the same ice material which I created for my ice arrows. And they're essentially all just using the same logic. So the next spell I wanted to create was essentially a big attack that you can shoot out in its projectile, and it does a bunch of area of effect damage. And this effect is essentially based on a type of dungeon theme that I created in one of my previous videos. It's very much Eldritch themed, and the type of magic the player is going to be able to access to use the spell, for instance, is heavily influenced and affected by that theme of dungeon and the creatures and lore behind it in the game. So essentially, this spell will do a lot of damage and do damage to nearby enemies. And I liked it because it gave a ranged magical damage option that will be on cooldown for also characters who are using a primary sword for their weapon. So essentially, you might be playing a spell blade and there's an enemy in the distance or a bunch of them, and you want to hit them before they get to you, you can use this type of spell. And the way I did it was very similar to how I made the fireball spell, but I added a bunch of jitter to the ribbon that is being pulled behind the projectile, and that makes it look much more chaotic. Then I essentially just added a bunch of black to the effect to make it look a little bit more eldritch, and also added an extra black ribbon that's getting pulled behind it as well, which I think in total made for quite a nice effect. Then it was just an impact and a muzzle effect as usual. But I wanted this to be a little bit more interesting. I didn't want it to just be a sudden burst of magic. There's some lore reasons and some story reasons about how a player will be able to access this type of magic, and that's why you'll see when the player casts a spell, they actually pull out a book, and using that book, the book lights up as they cast this magic. And essentially the way I did this was I made a book in Blender, I used Substance Painter to texture it, and then I used the same runes which I used in my dungeon in my previous video to fill out the pages on this book. And then as the book gets pulled out and the spell charges, the runes will start to glow. The material adapts and the runes start from being black to start glowing a light green, similar to the magic effect. And along with this, I wanted the book to essentially magically appear. So as the character puts out its hand, the book materializes in their hand. And this was actually quite simple to do, because if you watch my first video, there is a specific dungeon door that has a similar effect, and I adopted that and I adjusted it to work well for this book. So it essentially apparates in your hand and then disappears when you're done with it. The next spell I created was meant to be a secondary spell. It's essentially used for crowd control. When an enemy gets hit by it, they get disorientated and essentially they are put into a state of fear. So they have an animation that plays that kind of looks like they're freaking out. But if you do any damage to them, they get broken free of this illusion. And this spell is also using the same type of magic that the previous spell I showed is using. So they're all connected in the same kind of magic school, I guess. And it's a very basic small projectile. The only real difference between it and the fireball is a bunch of the sizing stuff. It's less impactful because I wanted to be quite a small effect. And it is also homing. So instead of it being a spell that you have to aim at a target and you have to make sure it lands, it will track the target you aimed at. So it's a homing projectile, so whoever you shoot it at, it will do what it can to adjust its path to hit them, which I thought was quite nice, because it can also be used by characters who are more melee focused. They're in the fight and there's an enemy coming up to them. They can quickly cast it in order to take that enemy out of the fight while they deal with whoever they're currently fighting. And I think it works quite nicely. Now finally, I'm so out of breath. This video recording has been going on for a while. Oh, we have the ultimate. And the ultimate, I'm quite happy with. I think it went really well. There's some things I would definitely work on. It's very complicated. The effects are complicated. But in general, for what I've been able to do, I'm quite happy with it. Essentially, I wanted it to be a powerful beam attack that does a lot of damage in front of you. And I wanted there to be a build-up of magic. So what I did was I created this charge up effect of this rotating energy and a bunch of particles spiraling out from the center of it. And that was actually not too hard. It just takes a little bit of time to get the timing right. But what was tricky was I wanted an animation to play while you're doing this. And I wanted the animation to kind of connect with the speed of the particles. So once I had the effect done, I started creating an animation of your character essentially pulling the magic around it and manipulating the magic. So I had to kind of time the animation to the particle effect, and it was a little back and forth. Eventually I had an animation I was quite happy with, but I had to kind of change the pacing of the charge up effect to kind of match. Then I needed to make the beam attack, and the beam is fairly complicated. There are a bunch of great YouTube videos. Just look up laser or beam particle effect, and they can explain it a lot better than me how it essentially works. But I wanted this beam to shoot out and actually be stopped by objects. So I didn't want it to be a beam that can go through objects and hit enemies behind them, etc. I wanted it to essentially stop and stay focused on a point, and then when that point moves out the way, or the enemy dies and falls down, it can go past them and hit whatever's behind them. So it is a bit of a tricky spell to make, but once you've done it once, you've done it and you can reuse it forever. And so watching a 10-minute YouTube video on how to do it is totally worthwhile. I think the effect looks really cool. There's some things I would change that I'm not 100% happy with, but in general, you charge up this big magical attack and then release it in front of you, and it just kills everything that is trying to get to you. But I wanted to have a bit of a build up in the beginning to add weight to it. But yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed this. These are the 5 spells that I've created, and obviously also the staff. It took a long time, but if I'm honest, I was finished with a lot of the stuff quite a while ago. Just finding time to record and to make a video is a bit tricky when you're trying to do real life stuff, make a video game in your spare time, and then also run a YouTube channel. It's a lot. It's a lot of work, and to sit down and just find the mental capacity to be like, okay, we're making a video now. Let's do it. It takes some time. But yeah, if you guys are still here at the end of it, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for sticking around to the end. If you have any comments, opinions, anything you want to tell me, let me know in the comments down below. If you have any cool spell ideas that you think would be a great addition, if you have any comments or ideas about how I've decided to handle the magic system or anything you think would improve it, please let me know. You guys have actually given me so many great ideas in the comments in the past, and things to think about. And yeah, if you have any game suggestions, especially, I know a ton of you are suggesting Dark Messiah. I will definitely check it out and try and gain some influence from that. I do know a fair bit about it, but I've never actually played it myself. So I will definitely check that out. But if you guys have any other suggestions or just want to say that thing sucks, let me know. I am always happy to hear from you guys. So yeah, if you made it this far, please feel free to like and subscribe. You know, have to handle the standard YouTube things. Any support really helps, and is greatly appreciated. We're still a very small channel, and we have grown quite a lot in the past few weeks, which has been so cool to see. But yeah, hopefully we can keep it growing. But I think that's everything. I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next video.